Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. This is an international webinar with 3 experts who work in the realm of nature-related finance, who we've been engaging with, and we really want to thank them for joining us. They're joining us from different countries and different time zones, including some quite early. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Center for a Smart Future, we are an interdisciplinary think tank based in Colombo with researchers, advisors, and practitioners around the world. We believe that Sri Lanka's economic recovery must be a just recovery, just by people and just by nature. Through our work, we influence policies to shape this. And we also work with other think tanks around the world, particularly in the region, on issues of common interest and common themes to developing countries. So CSF has several thematic pillars, out of which one is nature, climate, and the economy, where through our research as well as through outreach like this event, we inform and influence a more just and inclusive and green economy. Our work spans issues like conservation, finance, looking at changes in the financial sector, including green finance in the banking sector, debt for nature, swaps, and so on. We also work around nature positive business models, around reorienting important sectors like the tourism sector and looking at that interaction with nature. And we recently also looked at environmental disclosures among corporates. So all of these are research publications that you can find on our website. I won't speak for much longer, and I'd like to invite Arpana. So Arpana is really going to run today's session. Arpana is a visiting researcher at CSF and has been with us since 2023, contributing to that nature, climate, and economy thematic area. Her experience includes working in climate and environmental policy in the UK at the Green Alliance, at UNEP WCMC, at Chatham House, and the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. She has published written outputs across a range of climate and nature-related themes, including international climate policy, coastal resilience, and a just transition. She holds a master's degree from Columbia University's Climate School. Arpana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anushka, and thank you everyone for joining us. So today's webinar will explore some of the latest research and developments as it relates to integrating biodiversity in business and public policy. This includes ways to incorporate environmental values into the economy, and an overview of market-based instruments, as well as ways to develop bankable projects that align with wider environmental goals. So our speakers today, who I will introduce in a second, will provide actionable strategies for integrating biodiversity, ecosystem services, and resilience into economic frameworks to scale up both impact and investment. Just a few housekeeping rules before I begin my introductions. Please keep your audio on mute at all times, and feel free to drop in any questions you might have in the chat box. And after our speakers wrap up their presentation, we have set aside some time for an audience Q&A where you'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions and pop them in the chat box, and our speakers will be able to engage with you. So without further ado, I warmly welcome our 3 panelists who have very kindly dedicated time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. They're joining us from Ithaca, New York, Colombo, Sri Lanka, and Hong Kong, respectively. So our first speaker, Joshua Bishop, is an environmental economist and a natural resource economist with over 30 years of experience. He has published numerous articles and co-authored or edited 6 books, including a landmark UN study of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and was lead technical editor of the Natural Capital Protocol. Dr. Bishop has an appointment as an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Science at the University of Sydney. Previous employment includes WWF Australia, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN as we more commonly know it, and the International Institute for Environment and Development, or IIED. Dr. Bishop has been at the forefront of several global environmental economics initiatives, including the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, the Poverty Environment Partnership, the Katoomba Group on Markets for Ecosystem Services, and WWF's Global Food and Markets Practices. I first met Joshua at an event organized by the Sydney Environment Institute last year called Will Putting a Price on Nature Protect It, which is quite similar to the topic we're going to be discussing today. And I knew instantly that our audience in Sri Lanka would greatly benefit from his insights. So I'm really glad he was able to join us today. Next, Lucy Emerton, who has been a longtime collaborator with Center for a Smart Future on a number of different initiatives, is also the Director of Economics and Finance at the Environment Management Group, which is a consultancy group and think tank providing policy and planning advice and technical support in environmental sustainability into ecosystem valuation and the development of nature positive economic instruments, funding mechanisms, and investment approaches for a wide variety of government, bilateral, multilateral, non-governmental, and private sector organizations. Thirdly, Jean-Marc Champagne is the principal and managing director of Seneca Impact Advisors, based in Hong Kong, an organization which recently signed a memorandum of understanding with us at CSF. This specialized advisory firm develops innovative financial solutions to scale commercially viable nature and climate positive projects. Seneca's mission is to mobilize private sector capital for the protection and restoration of nature. Before founding Seneca, Jean-Marc dedicated 7 years to the World Wildlife Fund for Nature in his capacity as the head of bankable solutions for the APAC region. He nurtured and expanded scalable bankable projects with positive environmental and social impact. Jean-Marc's early career spanned 17 years in the financial services industry, where he advised institutional investors on equities and equity derivatives. So now I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Lucy Emerton, who is going to deliver her presentation. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks so much, Arpana, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everybody there. I am going to start at the very beginning. I'd like to talk a little bit and reflect a little on how the value of nature is being assessed and incorporated into the economy and decision making. And first of all, I actually want to make the very basic but very important point that nature valuation's been around for a while. On the one hand, it's now more than 3 decades since it really came onto the agenda. And really, where we started to seriously think about the economic value of nature and how to calculate it was, for those of you who are old enough to remember, in 1992, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Rio Summit, and especially the Convention on Biological Diversity really put the valuation of biodiversity on the global agenda and on the agenda of the countries who are signatory, including Sri Lanka, to the convention. And since then, we've seen the emergence of a body of methods and practices which have really become commonly accepted as to how to value nature. It's not easy, but it's something which is now very much within the periscope of economists. Even as you can see on the left of the screen, the UN Statistical Commission has even adopted a system of ecosystem accounting alongside GDP accounting practices. So it's really being mainstreamed at all levels. And what we've seen along with that is a massive growth in the application of ecosystem valuation, biodiversity valuation, nature valuation. This is really interesting. I did a little bit of research on Google Scholar looking at cited articles and books and journals and reports, and we've gone from about 100 documents on the value of nature a year at about the time that the Convention on Biodiversity came into force to an average of 1,000 or more over the last 10 years. So really now I think we can say there are many studies on the value of nature using accepted methods covering most biomes and most parts of the world, and that includes Sri Lanka. I've counted about 500 or 600 studies which have been carried out to calculate the value of biodiversity and ecosystem services in Sri Lanka. And I mean, here's a selection on the screen. Some of the studies have been done are more recent, some are less recent, some are more credible, some are less credible. But we're starting to get a good database here as well. And that brings me to my second point. And my second point is, I think it's really worth noting that the vast majority of studies across the world, including Sri Lanka, are looking at what is the value of nature for the broader economy, for the broader society, for the public interest. How much is nature worth to us all? There are far fewer studies on the financial bottom line, on the business value, on the private value of nature. But, and I mean, Josh, who we'll hear from in a bit, has been very instrumental in this. We have seen an emerging body of practice and methods which say, how do we apply nature valuation techniques to the private sector, to the financial bottom line, to return generating investments? And I think this is crucial because it really widens out what we're looking at. It makes some important points. It's revealed just how much nature is worth, not just in the public interest, but actually in commercial markets, in privately owned assets, and perhaps most importantly, to demonstrate the huge financial and economic gains and value added from nature positive business. So we're starting to see, still very embryonic, but we're starting to see this evidence in Sri Lanka and elsewhere of just what is the economic and business case for investing in nature conservation, for sustainable markets, for a more nature positive pathway. But the final and fourth point I want to make is, yes, we've now got a very large body of evidence on the public interest value of nature. That's very important for influencing public policy. We're starting to see corporate ecosystem valuation and financial bottom line valuation coming in, which is starting to show also there's a really important set of markets and investment potential associated with nature. But valuation may be great in making the case, raising awareness, but how do we actually change the way that people behave economically? How do we actually get people to factor the value of nature into their day-to-day household decisions, their business decisions, their company decisions, their national economic decisions? And however great the economic value of nature is demonstrated to be in theory, it doesn't really mean much unless there are real changes in the people doing business and the opportunities. And however convinced public decision makers are that it's in the public interest to take action, it has minor impacts unless people actually perceive there to be adequate gains in themselves doing so. And I think those are the burning questions we need to address. Yes, we need to value nature. Yes, we need to generate those evidence and arguments and economic case. But if we're really going to move forward to a more sustainable, equitable and nature positive economy, valuation is only a means to an end. The ultimate goal is to make this nature positive economy more economically and financially viable. And that means we actually have to change the way that we do business. And that's very much the entry point, I think, to where I hand over to my colleagues, Josh and Jean-Marc, to actually say, okay, how do we capture those values? How do we make them real? How do we put them in people's pockets? So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those really insightful remarks, Lucy. And I think that serves as a perfect segue into Joshua's presentation, who will now talk to us a little bit about how to internalize these environmental values that Lucy described into economic and business decision-making through a range of market-based instruments. So over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Arpana and Anushka, and thank you, Lucy, for your, as always, very clear and compelling uh, introduction. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see that, everybody. Very briefly, the question we're confronted with is how do we go from those values and valuations to changes in decision makings? And we use the term internalize as a sort of catch-all phrase for that. I've put a bunch of logos in at the bottom of this slide just by way of introduction. Those are sort of the organizations, the institutions that I've had the privilege to work with or be associated with or study at over the years, and they've really formed my views. And I think I want to stress that it's not just about environmental values or nature's values, it's also the social side. I've always been very keen to look at the intersection of poverty reduction and environmental management and think about how do we get more sustainable outcomes in broadly defined to include social equity as well as ecological sustainability. Lucy's covered some of the valuation topic. I'm not going to dive into the detail, but there are many different methods available out there that we can use to reliably estimate environmental values and how they're distributed among different stakeholder groups. I think it's worth reflecting, however, that even if prices matter, values matter, economic conditions matter, so does sentiment, and we've seen that many, many times. The way people feel about economic conditions can vary a lot. You look just at the recent US election, people who voted for the incoming president thought that conditions were terrible until the election, and then suddenly they thought economic conditions were looking great. And for the other side, it was the opposite. They thought economic conditions were pretty good up until the election and then terrible afterwards. Nothing changed in the economy, but people's sentiments did. And so that we have to somehow factor that into how we think about values and valuation. Lucy covered sort of what are the components of value we're concerned about here. What is nature? Well, it's biodiversity. What does that mean? Well, it's genetic variation, it's species diversity, it's also the variety of ecosystems. All of those different forms of biodiversity generate value. And as I said, we can estimate those values in monetary terms. We can also estimate them in qualitative or non-monetary terms. I remember some great work back in the 90s on participatory ranking and scoring, which didn't use money as a metric, but nevertheless managed to elicit from stakeholder interaction a sense of the relative importance of different environmental assets and ecosystem services. So we don't need to be limited to money when we think about value. Having said that, if you want to engage the business community and economic decision makers in business, we do need to translate environmental and social values into terms that are compelling to them. And money is what makes the world go round, as we all know. And so once we have a handle on the valuation techniques and the different methods available, we start to think about applications. And here's an example of a study that was done by S&P Global, a big stock market index firm, an advisory firm, and they looked at over 10,000 companies to try to quantify what are the environmental impacts of different industrial sectors. So I think the main point here is we need to drill down. We need to look at all the full range of environmental and social values, and then do the calculation, do the math for different industries, different companies, and in order to identify priorities, basically. Where should we focus first? If you look at this graphic, it would tell you, well, let's focus on fossil fuel generation, electric power generation from fossil fuels and manufacturing, and focus on greenhouse gas emissions because that's where the greatest impact is in economic terms, followed by other forms of air pollution and so on. Now, you can apply that same thinking at a company level, and here's an example from France, from Schroders. And basically what they do, look on the left-hand side, is they try to quantify the positive contribution that the company is making. Veolia provides sanitation services, water services, and they also pay salaries to their employees, and they train people. But on the downside, there's a range of pollutants that they're responsible for and impacts on freshwater resources. So you can quantify using those same valuation techniques, both the positive contributions, very important to acknowledge those, as well as the negative contributions. And you think about that, that's relative to sales. So relative to sales, they're looking great just on the positive side. But if you take account of some of those negative impacts, the company is perhaps not so impressive. Similarly, at a national level, this is an equivalent analysis done in terms of GDP, contributions to gross domestic product. Lots of positives, but also some negatives that need to be factored in, which bring down the total indicators of progress. So when we think a company is doing well or a country is doing well, when we do the math and look at the numbers, maybe it's not so impressive. So what do we do about that? Well, we need to think about changing the playing field, or leveling the playing field in ways that factor in some of those environmental and social impacts. And for business as usual, that means increasing costs, and there are different ways to do that. And it means reducing the benefits of business as usual. So I'm taking this from the perspective, say, of a government or a social planner, if there are any of those around. On the flip side, for what we perceive to be more sustainable business models, we want to look for ways to reduce their costs or increase the benefits that they obtain. And we have many, many levers for doing that. And I guess that's the crux of my introductory remarks is, what are these different levers that we can use? And usually top of the list is reforming harmful subsidies. So we know in many countries, governments continue to subsidize the use of fossil fuels, or excessive use of fresh water, or overfishing of wild fish stocks. And the first thing to do always is stop digging the hole deeper. That if you're in trouble, try to reform those subsidies, turn them around so that people are encouraged and supported to undertake more sustainable practices. We can also use tax credits. We can use a range of different public incentives to encourage best practice and encourage the adoption of more sustainable practices. Just one example, I lived in Switzerland for 9 years, and there the government offered a subsidy to farmers, but the subsidy was directed at adopting organic production methods. And so it was not just, here's money to produce more, but here's money to change the way you produce. I've listed voluntary certification and labeling there because it's not just governments that can shift the playing field and change the incentives. NGOs also have a role, and I've worked at NGOs most of my life, most recently at WWF, and we spent a lot of time on trying to work out how to create standards for sustainable production and then promote the adoption of those standards in business on a purely voluntary basis. Similarly, payments for ecosystem services can be implemented by governments, but they can also be introduced on a voluntary basis. Some companies may decide that it's economically advantageous to pay for an ecosystem service directly rather than, say, try to mitigate the problem at source. So, as an example, Perrier Vitel, a major water bottler in France, for years and years now, they have chosen to work with farmers in the catchment where their water comes from to try and reduce pollution rather than filter and remove the pollutants in the water. And we've seen the same thing, the famous case of the Catskills in New York State, where I am right now on holiday. It's cheaper to pay farmers to change their practices to reduce pollution than it is to try and remove the pollutants from the water after the fact. And there are many other schemes available. If you're interested, the Katoomba Group and the ecosystem marketplaces are great sources of information. Last on that list, you'll see public access to information. Disclosure, Anushka mentioned that, critical component of sustainability. Without the information, neither businesses nor consumers nor other stakeholders can figure out what to support and what to penalize. I'm not going to go into more detail now, but I can do. There's lots more that one could say. I just want to wrap up. As I said, key point is do the math, figure out what are the gains and losses, and then think about how do we change the balance of costs and benefits to the business as usual and to the more sustainable option. And lastly, I'll say that this is not a quick fix, right? I've been doing this for 30 plus years, and it's slow. And there are many, many setbacks, as we've seen, for example, here in the United States very recently. So you need to be determined, you need to be patient, but you can get there in the end. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and look forward to hearing from Jean-Marc and from all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bishop. That was very, very insightful. And I'm sure there'll be lots of follow-up questions. But just in the interest of time, I'm just going to move over to Jean-Marc to deliver his remarks on bankable projects. Over to you, Jean-Marc.
Okay, great. Thanks, Arpana, and thanks, Josh and Lucy. So yeah, I just want to, I want to just talk about initially, before I jump into everything, is just to overall framing of what we're trying to do here. So essentially, in order to achieve, even come remotely close to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and just using that as a metric, we need about 4.2 trillion US dollars a year going into environmental, social, all kinds of programs to achieve this SDGs. Currently, we have about 1.7 trillion going into the SDG goals. That means we have about a 2.5 trillion US trillion dollar investment gap, right? So we need to mobilize more private sector finance, right? And what we need to do there, if you think about it, 1.7 trillion sounds like a decent number, but when you compare it to global, capital markets, if you look at private sector debt, if you look at the stock markets around the world, I mean, we're talking about a very small amount of money. And if you also think about this, a lot of the financing that has been going on is financing negative impacts. So annual finance flows with direct negative impacts is about 6.7 trillion US dollars a year, and 5 trillion of that is coming from the private sector, right? And about 1.7 trillion comes from the public sector. And a lot of that is not just in, say, carbon related or things that are related to the climate, but they come from oil and energy, and it also comes from industrials, consumers, basic material producers. So there's a lot of negative financing that is going on. And then lastly, in terms of the positive financing aspects or impacts, annual finance flows is only 200 billion, which is tiny if you compare that to the amount that's the 6.7 trillion that's going into negative impacts. And of that, most of the 200 billion is 165 billion comes from public sources, and only 35 billion comes from private. So what does this mean? So what this means is that we need, a lot more private sector involvement in basically bending the curve in order to get to where we need to be to survive and have nature survival, and to have climate and to reduce our impact on climate. So essentially, we need to create economic incentives for bankable projects in environmental conservation, right? And so what are bankable projects? Bankable projects are essentially ones that have they have positive environmental and social impact, but they also create a return for investors, so they can actually attract investors. But in order to bring that in and incentivize bankable projects into conservation, you need to have policy frameworks in place. Governments can develop robust environmental policies that can integrate economic incentives. So these might include things like tax breaks, subsidies, and grants for businesses that invest in sustainable practices. Then you need something like carbon pricing, right? For example, these are just a high-level overviews. There's a lot more than this, but we don't have time to get into everything. But carbon pricing, for example, implementing carbon pricing mechanisms such as carbon taxes or cap and trade systems can encourage investments in low carbon technologies and conservation projects. Also, things like green bonds, right? So issuing a green bond can help finance environmentally positive projects. These bonds they're attractive to investors who are increasingly looking for sustainable investment opportunities. Also, you can think about public and private partnerships. So encourage collaboration between public and private sectors. They can lead to innovative solutions where shared risks in funding conservation and sharing the risks in funding conservation projects. Also importantly, and I think this goes a long way, is education and awareness. So raising awareness among key stakeholders about the economic benefits of environmental conservation that can drive more investment into sustainable projects. So that's absolutely important to have everyone understood that. So that means reaching out to companies and other other key stakeholders that can really understand how they can change and where the opportunities lie for them. Also, and addressing challenges in developing project pipelines in emerging economies, such as Sri Lanka, for example. So we can start off with, really with capacity building, right? So first you need to have strengthening the institutional capacities of emerging economies like Sri Lanka. That's that's absolutely crucial. This can be achieved through training and technical assistance in project planning and management. And then also, really importantly, and I think Anushka can attest to this, is regulatory frameworks, right? Establishing clear and supportive regulatory frameworks can attract both local and international investors. This includes streamlining approval processes and ensuring transparency. Also, access to financing is absolutely key. Enhancing access to finance for small and medium-sized enterprises can stimulate project development and can stimulate a lot of interest from small companies that want to potentially look in this area. Financial instruments such as microfinance or microloans and concessional loans can be very beneficial in this space. Also, stakeholder engagement. Engaging with local communities and stakeholders in the project development process ensures that projects are culturally and socially acceptable, increasing their chances of success. And then also, here's an interesting one that is, I recently started to pay a lot more attention to this, but data and analytics, right? So that, investing in data collection and analytics can also help identify viable project opportunities and assess their potential impacts, making project pipelines more attractive to investors. This is something, as I got involved in a project I worked on, that focused and looked more at technology and how we can involve that using data to find sources of problems in, say, supply chains, and how you can find the potential solutions to those problems. Also, lastly, I want to emphasize having experienced project developers or project owners or companies, which is, typically would be these SMEs that we mentioned earlier, but they need to be experienced in the area that they want to, get involved with, whether it's, sustainable, whether it's sustainable palm sugar, whether it's sustainable coffee, whatever it may be. They need to have experience in the track record and basically the ability to secure offtake agreements with particular clients. And then lastly, collaborating through blended finance mechanisms, benefits and challenges to those. Definition and purpose is really important to blended finance, which involves the strategic use of development of finance and philanthropic funds to mobilize private capital flows to emerging and frontier markets. The goal is to achieve positive social, environmental, and economic outcomes. So essentially, blended finance is really, you're taking grants plus investment capital, some kind of concessionary capital plus commercial rate of return capital, and you're bringing that together to de-risk projects and bring them into line with each other. So the benefits really, like I was saying, is risk mitigation, where blended finance can reduce the risk for private investors using concessional funds to absorb potential losses. And that could also be done not just through grants, but it can also be done through guarantees. Guarantees can also help attract private investment and make it more attractive, especially in emerging markets. Also, leveraging funds, leverage public and philanthropic capital to attract significantly larger private sector investments, thereby amplifying or multiplying the impact of available funds. Innovation and scale also by combining diverse sources of capital. Blended finance can drive innovation and scale up successful projects more rapidly than traditional financing methods. This comes with challenges, and I think Josh alluded to this a bit. When you look at the complexity, structuring blended finance deals can be complex and time-consuming. This stuff, unfortunately, along with political obfuscation that happens in countries like our own, Josh and I's in the U.S., you also have how difficult it is to get these projects off the ground and get blended finance to work and get all the key stakeholders involved. So that's it's something that needs to be. The expectations need to be set. This isn't an overnight solution. Also, alignment of interests, ensuring the objectives of all parties can be aligned or that are aligned are challenging. Public and philanthropic funds often have different goals compared to private investors, for example. Transparency is also key. Maintaining transparency and accountability in blended finance projects is essential to build trust among investors and stakeholders, because a lot of times what we're talking about is a new asset class, if you want to call it that. So they need to understand and have this transparency to really be comfortable getting involved in this, especially from the private investment side. Also, really important to the impact side and the grant side is having a measurable impact, developing standardized metrics for measuring the social environmental impact of blended finance can be difficult, but it's also crucial for assessing success, right? So you need to have that in place, and the projects need to have that well-defined when they're laying out their whole business and whole proposition. So to wrap up, really, countries can foster economic incentives and develop bankable projects by creating supportive policy frameworks, engaging in public-private partnerships, and leveraging innovative financing mechanisms like green bonds and blended finance. So also emerging economies such as Sri Lanka face unique challenges in developing project pipelines, but these can be addressed through capacity building, regulatory support, and stakeholder engagement. And lastly, blended finance offers significant benefits in mobilizing private capital for sustainable development, though it does come with some challenges that need careful management. But by addressing these factors, countries can stimulate investment in projects that align with environmental conservation and sustainable development goals. So I'll turn it back over to Arpana and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that, Jean-Marc. Very insightful. And I think it provides lots of key foundations that we can build on in the Q&A. So I'm going to take moderator's privileges and ask the first question. And this one's directed at Lucy, but Josh and Jean-Marc, feel free to chime in as well. Based on your experience, Lucy, working across 80 different countries, what do you think are some of the typical constraints that countries face when trying to place an economic value on nature? And what do you think are some key takeaways and lessons for a country like Sri Lanka?
I think there are several challenges. One is that, yes, we do have a toolbox of valuation methods, but some of them are so complex and academic and data heavy and time consuming that they're just not viable or even particularly useful to implement. And I think capacity is also a challenge. Many economists lack the training. Training in nature-related economic approaches doesn't tend to be part of the basic curriculum. And as a result, many valuation studies are not carried out by economists. They're carried out by people who actually don't necessarily have training in the method. And the third is data. We've got a real lack of data, particularly biophysical data. It's one thing to talk about valuing nature, but what about the data on the ecosystem services, on the biophysical linkages, on the hydrology, on the biology, on the ecology? That's still a real hindrance. But having said that, it's not rocket science. There are simple and practical methods around, and I think we need to start using them.
Absolutely. Thanks,
So,
Lucy. And Josh, I can see you unmuted.
I would jump in and add to that, and it's not just for relevant to Sri Lanka, it's relevant in every country, and that's vested interests, right? The people who are doing well from the status quo will try to protect the status quo. And we need to be clear about who they are and what they're trying to do, expose their efforts, and counter that as best we can. And that's a political process. It'd be nice if it was just, I agree with Lucy, data, technical complexity, capacity building, those are all critical. But we need to think about how to deploy that capacity in the face of powerful vested interests that don't want this to happen because they're making money from business as usual.
Thank you so much for that, Josh. And we've got a question from Anushka in the chat. I'm just going to read it out. Verification of impact has become quite controversial. We saw recent examples of credits get a bad name. Meanwhile, COP came up with a new carbon framework. How should Sri Lanka think about these issues? What should we guard against?
I'm happy to jump in on that because I've been working on voluntary standards, both for carbon and commodities for many years now. I guess, there's really no substitute for trying to reach collective agreement on what good looks like. And that's what a standard is about. Whether it's for carbon or biodiversity offsets or for cotton or for fish, we can figure this out, but you need everybody in the room. So when I was at WWF, we spent a lot of time building what we called roundtables of industry and NGOs and governments in some cases to try and figure out what good production looked like, how to standardize that, and then how to promote it. So I guess what I would suggest to countries everywhere, not just developing, but also developed countries, is participate in that process. Get involved in figuring out what good looks like. In some cases, you can formalize that. So in Australia, for example, we had a voluntary carbon market for many years, but the government sort of adapted and adopted some of that learning and created a formal set of methodologies or standards that have the government seal of approval. And then they have the power to not just support voluntary action, but to go beyond that, to make it mandatory in some cases. So in the case of Australia, what they did is they targeted the biggest polluters and said, you now have to meet this target of reducing your emissions, and you can use these approved methodologies based on these standards to offset some of your residual emissions where it's too expensive or technically unfeasible to eliminate emissions immediately. So I think governments can get involved in those discussions about what sustainable production and consumption looks like, and then figure out regulatory frameworks or incentives. They could be taxes, tax credits, or subsidies to try and promote adoption and adherence to those standards. But we don't really have a choice. We need the standards. Let's invest in them, make them work better. That's my short answer. And guard against, again, it goes back to vested interest. Guard against capture. I've been involved in many standards where industry said, oh no, we'll do this. We'll define what's sustainable. We don't need the NGOs involved. I think that's the wrong approach. So you need everybody at the table.
Thank you so much for that, Josh. Just moving on to another question that I received as a direct message on our Zoom chat from Sarah Dole. She asks, is there a standardized template that startups and innovators can use when quantifying economic and social impacts of their nature positive solutions so that we are speaking the same language when developing bankable projects or fundraising? So Josh, you listed a menu of different sort of tools we could use. And if there's like someone looking for a single answer, where should they go to? Is there one?
I wish there was a single answer. There are a number of consulting companies that will do the number crunching for you. It can be expensive. Or you can go to places like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They've developed a number of handbooks and guidebooks. The Capitals Coalition, based in London, is another good source of free information on how to do this. And they've been working with various accountancy networks and associations around the world to try and just promote awareness and make it easier to get started on accounting for nature in business. But Jean-Marc and Lucy, you may have other examples.
I agree with Josh. I'd highlight particularly the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. Google it. It's got some really good tools and approaches which are simple. You know, this is part of the problem, and it sort of answers Anusha's question a little bit on verification of impact. Sometimes the frameworks which are put together by consultancy companies and international conventions are so complicated that they're unworkable. A lot of the World Business Council stuff is actually very simple, and the whole natural capital coalition and natural capital framework has got some very practical tools. And I also do a bit of a plug, but no practical plug, for CSF here. I think CSF has been doing a lot of work on natural capital frameworks and may actually, you know, if you follow up with Anusha and others, may be able to point you in the right direction or even give you some tips.
Thanks so much for that, Lucy. And then moving on to our next question from Dushan Ranasinghe. Decarbonization, transition, or basically mitigation finance may have potential financing channels, but for a highly vulnerable island, it's the adaptation that matters, in my opinion. What sort of a model will give answers to the adaptation challenges in terms of financing, especially with the right blend of public-private partnerships?
Can I give a thought on that? And then I think that Jean-Marc might be able to follow up, and I'm sure Josh can. I mean, I think you're spot on, Dushan, that, you know, a lot of the focus has been financing mitigation because it's easier to find a return on investment for investors. Adaptation is key, and it's key for countries like Sri Lanka. And look at the National Adaptation Plan that's just being updated at the moment. Finance actually is a huge hole or a gap in that. From my perspective in nature-based solutions, I think we really have to look at nature-based solutions. How can we increase investment in ecosystems and nature, whether it's mangroves or forests in watersheds, or whether it's climate-resistant crops and conservation agriculture, which will give that economic return, but also strengthen the resilience of the businesses and farmers and the economy, and assisted adaptation. But the real challenge there is, yes, there's a high social return and economic return to nature-based solutions for climate adaptation, but it's very hard to identify bankable projects. Nadia, this also relates to your question, i.e., projects which will give investors a return on their money. The government can't afford to invest in the level of nature-based solutions that are required to help with climate adaptation and resilience. So how do we make them bankable? How do we make them things that companies can invest in and get a return on their investment? How do we make it things that external investors or blended finance facilities can give financing for? We've got to have bankable projects, and a bankable project means one which you can bank, which you can give to investors and say, yes, you'll get a return on your investment. And that's exactly what I guess Jean-Marc is working in.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a great lead in. Thanks, Lucy. You covered quite a bit, and I think that sets up for really. I mean, again, you covered quite a bit, and I think it's important to look at, you know, as was said, mitigation is something that's, you know, a lot easier to understand and define in terms of bankability. Adaptation tends to run into problems. Now, recently, even, you know, here in Hong Kong, I think it was last year even, we had a lot of banks jumping on this, you know, they like to jump on bandwagons and talk about, you know, what is the latest trend or what they want to get involved with. And adaptation happened to be that one. But they're sitting there saying that, but at the same time, they have no clue on how they're going to get money out of it. But just to talk about that, how do you get adaptation to be so-called bankable? Well, there's two core ways to do this. And in those two core ways, there's even more ways to kind of break that down. But the two core ways of doing that is, one, you tie it to a business, an adaptation, where there's adaptation impact. And the second one is you have financial mechanisms that can help make it bankable. So if you're talking about a business, you're talking about whatever it may be. You have a business that has where, let's say you're growing. One business that I'm working on is currently not in Sri Lanka, but it's, we're growing palm sugar, and the palms are completely different from palm oil, by the way. But the roots of the palm, the real important part of the adaptation is they are actually they tie in a lot of the soil, and they bind it together, helping with a lot of land slippage. And they bring land resilience back into the equation. But the business is tied to, well, the palm sugar, they extract and use that to sell sugar. And that in turn comes back and goes into the global market. And that in turn goes back to paying for the business, which in turn goes to producing and developing more of this product, which in turn goes to needing more trees to help bring together and bind the land. So that's just one aspect. The other one is developing financial mechanisms, which can be things like, of course, carbon credits, I think a lot of people are familiar with, but you also have things that are on the table but not ready yet, but things like biodiversity credits. But you can also have things like biodiversity offsets, which are slightly different. And you can tie those to your project. But then you can also have another sort of financial mechanism is outcome-based financing, where you can tie certain biodiversity goals or whatever goals you want to have, ecological goals, as they're tied to that particular area. Let's say you're trying to develop a mangrove or restoration of a mangrove, but you want to tie it to something, so then you can get outcome payments for that. Well, you can also set up an outcome payment type project and financing mechanism that'll pay for the outcome. So as you deliver outcomes, the investors get paid in terms of get paid back in terms of their investment. So those are the kind of things that you can put in place for adaptation. It's a lot harder to do than, of course, plain mitigation efforts. But those are some ideas that you can think about.
If I could build on excellent remarks from Lucy and Jean-Marc, I go back to the clean development mechanism. They had a 2% levy on every transaction, and that 2% levy went into an adaptation fund. Similarly, in the UK, more recently, when they implemented their biodiversity net gain policy, they require not just offsetting your direct footprint, but your footprint plus 10%, right? And so when you start thinking about these small add-ons, they can be really quite incremental. You can generate quite a lot of cash quickly. The challenge then is spending it well, right? And who controls the pot of money. I think on the voluntary side, a key priority is when we're talking with companies about nature positive and what that means for them. The targets that we develop with companies for nature positive need to include a restoration and adaptation component. And that's emerging best practice. We haven't yet defined what those standards and methods are, but I think inevitably adaptation will be part of the mix alongside mitigation and social benefit.
Thank you so much for that, all three of you. I noticed that Paul Steele turned his camera on, and I would sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you did have any specific questions, feel free to chime in as well. We'd really appreciate that. Okay, till then we can move on. I've just got one more question on in my DMs. So Lucy, you briefly mentioned ecosystem services data now being incorporated into GDP. Could you talk a bit more about how crucial that is in getting a country to move towards a nature positive economy? Do you think it's an essential prerequisite, or is it just a nice to have?
Yes, no, no, yes, yes, no. I mean, yes, in the sense, and this has been recognised for a long time, factoring the environment or natural resources into GDP and national accounting was something that economists got interested in very early on in the 90s. Yes, in the sense that at the moment, our measures of GDP and economic growth for countries, Sri Lanka's GDP, doesn't reflect sustainability. So you often get countries, Indonesia in the 70s and 80s is a good example, that record monumental growth in GDP. But how is that growth taking place? It's by chopping down forests and mining minerals. And as long as you don't show the costs that that incurs, you're actually giving a completely false economic picture of the country's performance, and also maybe wrong policy and market messages. The implication is invest in oil palm, invest in deforestation. So yes, in that sense, it is important, just as we need to incorporate other social measures, gender and other things. So yes, I think it is really important, and it's important at the level of companies and businesses. And we see, Josh talked about it a bit, we see a lot of measures for companies to also factor biodiversity ecosystem services into their accounts and even share value. I've just been doing some very interesting work for a Japanese marine insurance company, which is seeking to factor its investments in mangrove restoration into its own accounts on the basis that that's actually affecting its premiums, its profits. So yes, and the no is, not the no, the caveat is it's incredibly difficult. You require highly trained people and a huge amount of data. So we need to find practical ways to do it. The World Bank has been doing a lot of work on this. If people Google World Bank waves, they'll see several examples of trying to factor ecosystem services into national accounts. Wealth accounting for the valuation of ecosystem services, WAVES stands for. And there's some examples from other Asian countries which are very interesting, maybe for Sri Lanka to look at, particularly the Philippines. They've done a lot of work on this.
Thank you so much for that, Lucy. And Paul, I do see your message in the chat. Yes, feel free to chime in and turn your camera and mic on.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. I can speak, but unfortunately the camera doesn't seem to open up. But
That's all right.
anyway, thanks for the opportunity. And it's lovely to see particularly Josh, who I've not seen for many years, and also to hear from Sri Lankan colleagues. Yeah, I mean, I would just stress a number of the points that the speakers have made. I think they presented extremely clearly. I mean, one is this issue of valuation's great, but as Lucy said, so what? How do you monetize it, and how do you link it to the real economy? And you know, living in Sri Lanka as I do, I know the priority for the government is two things, as in many countries, but particularly Sri Lanka. It's raising revenues and it's creating jobs. I mean, revenues is urgent because the government is essentially broke, and jobs are crucial because if you go to the immigration department, you see sad queues of people trying to leave the country in the hope of a better future. So the question is, how can natural resources and conservation and sustainable management address those two priorities of the new government of revenues and growth and jobs? I mean, I think the window that the new government provides is quite exciting, and they are looking for ideas. They do seem quite fresh compared to obviously the governments we've had for some time in Sri Lanka. But the challenge is, as I say, to turn it into revenues and jobs. I mean, in terms of, there are examples of taxes that can be raised. I mean, subsidies, I think the government is less likely to go for because it's a loss of revenue. But if we can find taxes on natural resources, that's one way to proceed. And then if I mean, tourism is obviously booming at the moment, which is also great in Sri Lanka, which may be able to provide sustainable jobs. I mean, the danger is that there's a kind of rush for unsustainable tourism, and was already again seeing that happening with low budget tourism coming back as it did before. And I see the government wants to go up from 3 million tourists a year, 2 million tourists a year, which is already a huge amount, to 3 million tourists a year. So how to manage that sustainably is going to be a huge challenge. So I mean, those are really questions for the Sri Lankan colleagues in the audience. How do you square this circle of sustainable management, revenues, and jobs? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was already useful, and I think definitely resonates with a lot of what we've spoken about today. I'm just looking at the last two questions that we have, and we've got time for just to address those two. So Hishal Piris, who was one of our former colleagues at Center for Smart Future, has asked, when it comes to natural capital and biodiversity, there are challenges associated with ownership, control, and management of these financial assets. Can you share examples of innovative legal or governance practices that address these in peer economies or frontier markets? Thanks for that question, Hishal.
I can have a go, if I may. I'm not sure that Australia is a frontier economy, but Northern Australia is a frontier region. It's a very high proportion of indigenous population, relatively undeveloped economy, or rather heavy emphasis on primary production, mining, agriculture, and so on. And one interesting innovation that happened over the last few decades is the development of what we call cultural burning. It's the idea that if you reinstate traditional land management methods led by indigenous communities, you can generate new revenue from the sale of carbon credits. And the government supported this, so they put in place the institutional framework, including approved methods for generating carbon credits by restoring traditional land management methods. And importantly, those projects are owned and controlled by the indigenous communities. And so they reap the benefit, they build the capacity, they get the jobs. But the revenue comes essentially from polluters or from the government itself, hence taxpayers, to try and help meet greenhouse gas mitigation targets. So, I mean, that's one example. I would look particularly at the example of the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation in Australia, ABCF. You can Google them. And they've now started broadening their remit, not just in Australia, but also in Papua New Guinea, in East Timor, in the Solomon Islands and other Pacific countries, to try and explore how can local communities and indigenous groups take advantage of some of these nature markets and carbon markets to generate both jobs and capacity and new sources of revenue. I think we've also learned quite a lot over the years from RED projects, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. They've had a bad rep in the last couple of years because of some notable failures, but the standards have been tightened up, and there are many good examples, probably more good examples than bad examples, of where local communities have been able to revive their traditional livelihoods, maintain and restore natural ecosystems, and earn money for doing so from international investors. Paul mentioned ecotourism, or tourism rather. If we can sort of make that high-end or high-value tourism by adhering to ecotourism standards, I think that's a promising path as well. And a vast industry, 10% of global GDP and growing very fast. So lots of potential there.
Thank you so much for that, Josh. And Lucy and Jean-Marc, do you have anything to add to that, or we can move on to the next question if you don't?
I've written something in the comments, so I won't say anything more.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment though. I mean, I think we covered quite a bit already. But just in terms of, just kind of going back a little bit, but in terms of adding in, it's important that, when you value companies, that the, basically the value of nature needs to be incorporated in that. If we start doing that and we actually put that into GDP as well and how we look at GDP, I think that'll actually take care of a lot of the issues that we're having, because right now, everyone, the world, countries, companies are getting a free ride on nature and the resources that it provides, right? So I think if that starts getting factored in and companies start getting discounted for the basically the pillaging of nature as they do, then that'll actually change a lot of things about how you value a company. But yeah, just wanted to add that in, and yeah, if there's another question, happy to take that.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marc. And we've got that question from Krishani, and Lucy, you responded to that in the chat. Thank you very much for that. But just to build on that a little bit, so Krishani has asked, how likely is it for the typical green financing or investment companies to take risks in providing equity financing or debt financing for carbon credit projects? Or this could also apply to biodiversity credit projects in Sri Lanka, which already has a forward offtake contract with a confirmed buyer, or the likelihood of them to provide free financing. And I think in an economy that's already struggling, what do you think could incentivize these investment firms to make these decisions in more responsible ways?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was directed to me, but I answer partially on that. It depends. First of all, in carbon credits, there was a lot more appetite for that, up until recently. Carbon credits, there's been a bit of shying away from because of the potential problems that have been around that. But with that said, I think, it's really important. It depends on, again, what kind of project that you're looking at and what the project entails. Is it carbon credits that are based on a complete restoration? Is it carbon credits that are based on preservation? What kind of product, or I don't know what we're talking about, or maybe I missed that, because that'll impact heavily upon how a company gets involved and the worthiness of those particular carbon credits.
I'd just like to pick up on one point that I just emphasised in the chat box as well, because I think it's a really important one. I know, Krishani, you asked specifically about financing for carbon credit projects, but I think your question highlights a much bigger issue, which is a real challenge, at least in the work I do, which is the whole thing of risk and risk financing. And it seems that really often a major constraint, either to companies getting engaged in new markets or making new nature positive investments or attracting external debt and equity finance, is the whole thing of risks. The companies are not in a position to bear that risk, and investors are unwilling to bear that risk in their own investments. And I think that also just highlights a more general point, that something that's been very neglected and we really have to work on is the whole thing of risk financing and stepping in to underwrite or mitigate or bear some of that risk. The US Development Finance Corporation and several development banks have been quite active in that, not specifically in carbon credits, but in just attempting to minimize the risk to investors and minimize the risk to companies. I think it's also something which is really interesting if you look at things like the green carbon finance facility. I think it's also interesting if you look at some of the financial institutions here, like DFCC, and the role that they may play in trying to sort of stimulate and support more nature positive investment and markets. But I think it's something we really have to look at, because I think, certainly in my experience, risk remains a major constraint to investors and companies getting involved.
Thank you, folks. I'm not sure if you can see me. Yes. So Arpana just had a bit of a technical issue. So we'll see if she comes back online. But I just had a quick question to Lucy, Joshua, and also JM as we go towards closing today's session. If I can ask each of you one question, if there was one capability that Sri Lanka, I know it's a big one, Sri Lanka is, you know, a country that's trying to move forward to this one capability that we need to improve on and really hone in on if we are to do this right, learn from some of the examples where these financing instruments have hurt communities, have not shared risks equally, have got bad reputations. So Sri Lanka has the benefit of seeing those examples that didn't work so well. So if there was one capability that you would think that we need to start really getting better at, what would that be? So Joshua, Lucy, and James, what would be each of yours choice of the one capability?
Fine. Thank you, Anushka. I'll jump in first since you named me first. Because of my recent experience at WWF, but even before then, I would emphasize standards. I think a good understanding of the emerging universe of sustainability standards, whether those are voluntary or multilateral or national, would be a great basis for making headway on nature positive economy.
Thank you. JM or Lucy, do you want to, what's your choice? If you had to point to one.
Yeah, I can go. I mean, I would sort of align with what Josh just said, but in terms of, you know, measuring impact, that I think that needs to be very clear. And that could be whether you're developing, you know, things like are trying to attract financing or in for debt for nature swaps, whatever it may be, whether a green bond, whether it's starting a bankable project, but having the impact defined, measured, and, you know, and transparent, whether it's measuring social or environmental impacts, because that can be very difficult when you're trying to, you know, assess the success of a project or whatever it is that you're trying to kick off. And that goes kind of back to what Lucy said about risk. You know, risk is a key. You know, sometimes I wonder though about risk with the financial world. They say that, but yet they're willing to invest in risk in things like, you know, crazy startups and technology. But when it comes to, you know, it comes to nature, they seem to be, you know, make all kinds of excuses not to invest in it. But at the end of the day, we're talking, you know, that does talk about risk. But I think impact can help that a lot, especially if you're talking about development financing, or development aid, or development, you know, loans, or impact capital. That would help quite a bit.
I mean, Anush, what does the one thing Sri Lanka need? I have to answer a magic wand. However, in the absence of a magic wand, I think it's not, I think it's to do with political buy-in and support. You know, our instruments and approaches and whatever are there, they're imperfect, you know, they need work, but without political support, and I mean political with a small p. I don't mean, you know, the president coming out and saying nature positive economy, although that would be very nice. I mean, support of the CEOs, support of the shareholders, support of the directors, support of the people who are controlling the aid budgets to Sri Lanka, support of all these projects that are coming in, support of the government as well. I think that's what's needed. And what goes along with that is the incentives for companies or farmers or households or businesses or sectors or industries or whatever to actually be able to do this. We see a lot of subsidies and preferential treatment being given to other sectors of the economy and other goods and services. Let's see nature-based investments and services coming in there as well. And yes, I mean in public policy and fiscal instruments. I do mean the government, but I also mean in all the other support and finance that is flowing in the public interest and the private interest to Sri Lanka. How do we get it a willingness and an awareness and a buy-in and a support there? And then out of that, how do we mobilize the capital? the finance and the investment flows, but without the broader enabling conditions and incentives, doesn't matter how many standards and frameworks and valuations and facilities we have, I don't see it working. And I think we're still lacking that. We've got to get it up the agenda of the people who matter. And that means that people like us, you know, in this virtual room, actually have to be far smarter about it. And it means that the efforts of people like the Chamber of Commerce and Biodiversity Sri Lanka and the financial institutions like DFCC, who are working with GCF and with other financing facilities, is so important. We have to give much more showcasing and push to those efforts. And look for that magic wand, please.
So I fully endorse everything that Lucy and Jean-Marc have said, and I can't help but point out that they didn't limit themselves to one thing. That's okay. In which case, I'll add one more thing, which is communications and marketing. Building on Lucy, you know, we're sort of techno nerds, the three of us. But what you really, and with all due respect, what you need are people who can communicate and market this kind of approach. Why does nature positive matter? How can people get involved? What are the opportunities? And that is really a marketing challenge.
And Josh, I would point out to you that the essence of being a successful economist or conservation economist pushing biodiversity in nature is to take the numbers and manipulate them. So when Anush says 1, as a good economist, I interpret that as 5. You should know that.
Hear, hear.
Thank you so very much. And I apologize to our attendees because we've gone 5 minutes over time, but I think that's the perfect note for us to end on. And this conversation today has quite literally connected all of us from all corners of the world. So thank you so much again to our incredible panelists who have taken the time to very kindly come and share all their insights and answer all of our questions. And we will hopefully this is like the start to a conversation that we can continue in Sri Lanka, and we will get back in touch with some resources, links and reports and sources that have been mentioned throughout this webinar with the attendees. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone again for attending, and thank you to all the speakers. I'm just going to hand over to Anush just so he can wrap up with some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, folks. Thank you so much, Arpana, for very expertly guiding this session that covered a lot of issues, but also towards the end, I think we got to some very specific points that I hope our audience finds actionable. I just want to also acknowledge that the audience was very diverse. I was just looking through who we had. We have folks from the Central Bank, consultants to the World Bank, financial institutions, environmental organizations, and activists, researchers. So we had a very interesting, diverse mix. Also, I think some organizations were already mentioned by Lucy. There are also others who we do some work with, but also others who are out there doing really incredible work in this space, trying to push the boundaries. Blue Resources Trust, Biodiversity Sri Lanka, IUCN, which is doing something on with the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, Environment Foundation, Lanka Environment Fund, and others. So we are fortunate to collaborate with some of them, but also I think we are fortunate that they are active in this space at all and kind of helping to move this relatively new agenda forward fairly quickly. Because as I mentioned earlier, CSF really cares about making this economic recovery not about building back better, but about building forward differently. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Our publications are on our website, including some that cover topics that were discussed today. Some forthcoming publications that you might want to look out for is we have a knowledge primer coming out that breaks down what blue carbon credit schemes and blue carbon projects are like, because there's a lot of interest around this, and we want to make sure that folks understand the nuances of this. We have some new research coming out on the interaction between tourism and nature at 3 sites in Sri Lanka. We have also other policy briefs coming up relating to this very topic of environmental accounting being integrated into national accounts and going beyond GDP. So I'll stop there. Thank you all for joining. And once again, thank you to all the speakers and particularly to Arpana. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Good morning.